All right, we are back, and I'm just going to go ahead and have County Council report out from closed session.
The board met in closed session to consider one item of public employee performance evaluation. The board conducted a discussion on the matter and provided direction. This concludes the report out of closed session.
Thank you, Karen. All right, so it is time for our budget workshop. And Todd, I'll let you kick that off, please.
All right. Good morning, supervisors. We have one of two workshops we're having today. The first one's regarding our the budget, not only for kind of financially where we're at to date. We're going to touch on a number of different topics, some pertaining to what we experienced over the last 6 to 8 months. And we're also going to be talking about budget policies, financial policies, as well as preparation for the development of the 21-22 budget. Daniel Vick, Daniel Chatney are both here. They're going to walk through the slide presentation with you, and please feel free to ask any questions during it. We'll have a follow. Oh.
Thank you, Todd. Good morning, Chair Gore, members of the board. I'm Daniel Chatney with the County Executive Office. I just want to introduce my budget team real quickly. Daniel Vick to my right, Adam Wade, Barbara McAllister, and Chad Fenstermarker. And I just want to express my thanks to them for their efforts in pulling this workshop together for us today. So we have a slide presentation to go through, and as Todd mentioned, be happy to answer any questions as we go through this. This is intended to be a workshop and not just a one-way conversation. So please ask questions or comments along the way. So on today's agenda, we plan on covering these topics here: COVID-19 economic impacts on the county operations, talk about county financial policies updates, PERS and OPEB funding strategies. We'll discuss the condition and projection of some of our major operating funds, discussion on the fiscal year 21-22 budget development policies, and then finally 21-22 budget timeline and calendar. So we'll lead with the COVID-19 economic impacts. So last year at the budget workshop, we talked in November, and we talked about unemployment. And at that point in time, Placer County was experiencing the lowest unemployment rate in 5 to 6 years at 2.6%. So a lot's changed since then. So now we've peaked out in April of 2020 at 13% unemployment. And then in September of 2020, back down to 7.1%. So obviously it follows the trends statewide and nationwide with in relation to the COVID pandemic. But just as a touch point from where we were last year to where we are now, kind of a significant difference there. In the past couple board meetings or budget discussions, and including on October 27th, we've talked a lot about sales tax revenues and how they've been impacted by the COVID pandemic. So this slide is comparing fiscal year 2018, 2019, and 2019-20 in the fourth quarter sales tax receipts. So you can see on the public safety sales tax side, a decrease of about $1,023,000 or an 8.3% reduction in actual receipts. And on the general fund sales tax side, a slight increase of $137,000. Now that probably seems to be a little counterintuitive as we talk about sales tax declines. And there's a couple reasons for that. The first one is on the sales tax side, Placer County, that is a direct sales tax receipt. So unlike public safety sales tax, which goes into a pool statewide and absorbs all the losses and increases across the entire state and then is distributed, these are direct sales tax for Placer County. So what story that tells is that sales tax declines or increases in Placer County were not affected by the rest of the state and were better off than the rest of the state combined. The other piece that goes into that equation is the Wayfair decision, which the first part of that, this is online internet sales from out of state. And the first part of that went into effect in April of 2019, which was at the tail end or in the fourth quarter of fiscal year 18-19. The second part of that sales tax came in October of 2019. So the difference there would be that the fourth quarter of 19-20 received the entire piece of the Wayfair increases versus just a small portion that occurred in fiscal year 18-19. So.
Yeah, go ahead.
Daniel, on the public safety sales tax, does that come back per capita? Is that how it's distributed to counties? Or what's the formula then when it goes to the state pool and then?
So it's a factor that is influenced by the point of sale transactions in the geographic or in the geographic areas. So how the direct sales tax performs in Placer County is one of the factors that goes into how that is distributed statewide. Yes. And in this case, what we saw with Placer County is we saw a slightly increased factor, so a bigger percentage of a much smaller pie. So, and then an overall decrease. So, yep. So the next slide is showing the difference between 2019-20 budgets and actuals. So our fiscal year 2019-20 budget for general fund sales tax was $16.8 million, and we actually received $16.7 million. So a difference of about 100,000 overall, or a 0.6% reduction. In fiscal year 2021, where our current budget, if you remember, was established pre-COVID, and we left that static until we could see the actual impacts of COVID-19 through the year. And we budgeted $17.9 million, and currently our latest projection is down 8.8%, or $16.3 million. So obviously still early in the fiscal year, and as the COVID pandemic still works through the system and businesses open or reopen or close and come back up, we expect to see some choppiness throughout the year on our projection there.
You think after all these years, are we trying to track any relationship between relatively more aggressive and less aggressive shutdowns in the county and sales tax?
We haven't started tracking that as a specific item, but we certainly can. I think when we get to some of the later slides, when we talk about industry, we can see, the impacts to restaurants and the hotels, and how the restaurants, they were essentially shut down at the beginning, and then they were allowed to reopen partially, outside seating, and then indoor seating 50%. And so we can see those starting to come up a little bit, but we can do some more specific tracking on how reopening is affecting those.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. And then I think there would be a strong correlation between some of the sociological behavior also, that wouldn't want to make that too exotic, but certainly I think it would be worthwhile trying to get some timeline on that, and maybe send that over to Rob at HHS to see if there are some metrics that he has that would connect to that, see if there are any correlations.
Okay. Okay, so moving over to public safety sales tax for the same comparison of fiscal year 1920 and 2021. The 1920 budget was set at 49.3 million. Actual receipts were 47.6. So a deficit there on the public safety sales tax side of about 1.7. For 2021, again, the budget was set pre-COVID, and the expectations there were increased sales tax growth. So $50.5 million budget compared to a current year projection of 48, or a difference of $2.5 million. So that would be, a key indicator here of thinking how the public safety fund as a whole might end the fiscal year. They came in with a balanced budget, utilizing some fund balance for capital reserves, but these would be operational revenues that would help support their operational costs. We showed this slide on October 27th, just kind of a picture of service stations down 36.1, as we could expect those to be. We saw growth in building materials, grocery stores, garden, agricultural, but the big one was the county pool, or this is the Wayfair, the out-of-state online purchases, up 45.5%. So that was kind of the stabilizer for sales tax for us in fourth quarter 2019-20. This graph is showing kind of a higher level view, and not at the category level, but kind of at the industry level. And you can see that big 45% increase on state and county pools from 538,000 up to 783,000. So this just adds a dollar impact to those same categories that we saw on the previous slide. And then in the industries where we saw the decline, restaurants and hotels down from 693,000 down to 372. So it just adds dollars to the percentages from the previous sales tax slide. And then going into TOT, or transit occupancy taxes, at the last board meeting on October 27th, we again showed some numbers and some revenues for TOT, both for the general fund and the Tahoe area. And we were showing those numbers as actuals compared to budget. So what we did is, based on some of the questions from Supervisor Gustafson, we took a different look at it this time and compared it as to actual dollars from the previous 2 fiscal years. So you can see the trend starting in fiscal year 17-18, and this is just for the general fund TOT revenue of 8.4 million, increased up to 9.2 million in fiscal year 18-19, and then decreased to 7.5 million for fiscal year 19-20. And then you can see the receipts for the first 3 months of this fiscal year. So when we presented this the last time, the percentages of decrease were much smaller because of the amount that we budgeted for those revenues. But when you talk actual dollars, there's a much more significant impact to those TOT revenues.
I had a follow-up on that.
Yeah.
On say July, when you're showing negative numbers, I didn't understand this chart, but I was reading it late last night.
Yeah. So on the revenue side, these are accruals and accounting techniques. So essentially, what the receipt would be for the prior fiscal year. So it's deducted. It won't come in until the new fiscal year. So it's accrued backwards, and then it starts negative. And then once the new receipts for the new year come in, then it offsets that negative.
Thank you for running this.
Sure. And so this is a similar slide for the TOT tax on the general fund side, and it just shows the year-over-year change. Obviously, on fiscal year 18-19 to 19-20, a $1.6 million decline, or 18%. And the same slide for our Lake Tahoe Tourism and Promotion Fund, or the Tahoe area. You can see our fiscal year 17-18 receipts of $10.7 million. And then that increased to 12.5 million in fiscal year 18-19, and then 19-20 back down to 10.2. The budget for fiscal year 19-20 was 10.8 million. So obviously the deficit between the two, budget and actuals, is less significant than the actual $2.3 million reduction in actual TOT for that area, and almost a 19% reduction. So one of the other areas that we don't talk a lot about, but are realignment dollars. We did a calculation early on, and it came up with about $6.8 million for fiscal year 2021, the realignment impact for our HHS and public safety funds. We did receive our share of the first realignment backfill from the state government. That was $4.3 million. And the way that split works when it arrives at the county, HHS received about $3.6 million of that, public safety about $800,000, and you can see what numbers they are still assumed to be short based on those that backfill number, or that projection of realignment loss. So $2 million on HHS and almost $500,000 in public safety.
And was there an explanation as to why?
Well, the realignment's based on sales tax also. Okay. So we knew that would be reduced, and that's coming from the state through a pool that way. The $4.3 million in backfill was the first $750 million that the governor authorized in his budget. There was an additional trigger up of $250 million based on receipts of new stimulus money from the federal government. That didn't happen by the October 15th deadline. So we missed out on that second injection of realignment backfill. So this is essentially would be the equivalent of a sales tax reduction also. Perhaps one of the bright spots in our work is what's going on in CEDRA, in our building industry. This is a chart that's comparing permits submitted from calendar year 2019 and 2020, and you can see the 2019 in blue is reflecting higher numbers in April and May, and June, and then the numbers start reversing in July, August, September, and October, where we see the activity picking up on the numbers of permits submitted. I think in our prior conversations internally, this is a lot to do with at the very beginning of the pandemic, everyone was a little nervous and unsure of what was coming. And so maybe everybody held off a little bit. And then once they got their footing secured and saw what was happening in those industries, and then they started submitting their building permits. A very similar slide that tells the same story. These are permits issued. So ones that went through the entire review process and were issued for construction. You can see those numbers almost leveling out in June, and then in July, August, September, October. It's a significant increase in activity from year to year. Borrowed this slide from the California Association of Realtors, and I apologize if it's hard to read. The numbers are pretty small, but there's just some key indicators on here about how the real estate and the housing market is doing in Placer County. A median home price for a single-family detached home of $530,000. That's a 7.1% increase year to year. We're seeing unsold inventory. The median time on the market for single family detached home of 9 days. That's a decrease of 62% year over year. Home sales increased 57.6%. So it's just telling a story here that the real estate market is moving quite profoundly, which we would expect would result in perhaps some higher and better growth in property tax revenue in fiscal year 21-22. And it just is, along with the building permit activity, just kind of tells that same story of that market or that industry really kind of unaffected at this point through the pandemic. We've done a pretty good job, I think, talking about CARES Act over the past 8-9 months now. Again, it was signed into law March 27th, 2020, appropriated $150 billion to states, territories, tribal, and local governments. Placer County, since our population registered as under 500,000, received our allotment through the state of California, and ours was $41.1 million, which we received the 100% of to date. We've identified about $20 million of that to go to county needs to respond to the pandemic, and $13 million appropriated for the Placer Shares program, which doesn't include the $1.25 million for the Placer Eats and Drinks program that could fall into that same category. The CARES Act does have an expenditure deadline of December 30th. And with the discussion and the actions that were taken on October 27th, we're fully confident that we will have expended all those funds before the December 30th deadline and would be at no risk of returning anything to the state or federal government. But we don't talk a lot about what else was included in the CARES Act as far as support for local jurisdictions. So we did, 3 examples of some additional funding that was included in that act that went directly to some of our programs in the county. So the first one is the $25 billion that was allocated to transit agencies to help prevent, prepare for, and respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So Placer County's share of that was $7.3 million, and that's a multi-year effort. So they'll use that to balance out reductions in local transportation funds or sales tax-based revenues that go to support transit operations. The Help America Vote Act made available $930,000 to Placer County to help run the federal election on November 3rd. And then there was also an award of about $3 million that's available to Placer County through November of 2022 to support COVID-19 testing, epidemiological surveillance, and related activities. So we talk a lot about the $41.1 million, but there were other components of that act that helped support some of our operations directly. With that, I'll take a brief moment to pause and see if there are any comments or questions on that first segment of our workshop. Okay.
I do have one
Sip of water.
quick
Go ahead.
question. I'm very curious. Obviously, looking at our numbers, we held our own in terms of sales tax generation, but we were dragged down by the pools. Do we have county by county distributions that show where sales tax receipts did drop off significantly?
We can, and I actually had a conversation with one of our sales tax consultants just yesterday about this similar kind of thing. And a lot of the declines across the state were in what we would refer to as international travel hotspots. So Los Angeles, San Francisco, for the most part, those areas saw drastic reduction in international vacationers and tourists. So hotels, restaurants, and the similar were a big reduction
do
there.
we have the breakdown to the level of granularity that you have here that shows that, in fact, the rest of their sales tax receipts were fairly static and it was just the travel and tourism industry?
We have the supervisor, we have those for the Sacramento region that we can compare to. So we can compare to Sacramento County, Yolo County, Yuba County, El Dorado County, and some of those geographically close counties. We don't have them statewide, but we can get those in the non-confidential portion of that sales tax.
Right.
But
Right. It's kind of to Supervisor Wygant's question earlier. I'm curious to see. I mean, I know that that Mayor Garcetti got fairly militant there for a while on, threatening people that he was going to shut off their power at their places of business if they didn't adhere to the lockdown. And I'd be very curious to see if across the board, like in Los Angeles County, which happens to be, about a quarter of our state's population in the one county, if a drop in their general sales tax, as opposed to just the travel and tourism related economic activity, thereby affected all of us negatively economically by virtue of the pool.
cool.
All right, thank you.
So the next section of our presentation or workshop today is working on some work that we did with the county financial policies. So back on November 9th, 2019, when we did this workshop, the board tasked our finance committee to further define fund balance options and then bring them to the board at a future meeting for discussion. So that's kind of what we're doing today with some of these financial policies. But as we got into the work on the county budget and financial policy specifically, there were some other changes through some of the other county in the county financial policies that we wanted to recommend to your board for discussion and then ultimately, hopefully, for approval. So the effort between the finance committee, county council, our elected treasurer, tax collector, auditor, controller, we did make updates to all four of the policies that are included in there. So budget financial policy, our middle fork project revenue policy, or pension and OPEB policy, and debt management. We did submit a red line version of all the policy changes with the board packet. I know that was probably not really fun to try to read through or look through at the same time. So I've highlighted for today at least some of the significant updates that we made into each policy, and we can have our discussion from there. So on the budget and financial policy, the significant updates that we made are we combined our economic uncertainties and general reserve into one general reserve category. There was no accounting or legal requirement to have those separately, and they really were there to serve the same purpose. So we combine those in the future fund balance statements and audited financial reports will reflect those under one category. And we are recommending an increase of the minimum for that general fund reserve to move from 5% to 10%. The GFOA recommends, I think, 60 days of operating capital and 10%, slightly lower than that, but it's at least moving in a more positive direction to secure some additional funds into that general reserve for contingencies.
Quick question, if I may. Given the relative stability and consistency of property tax as opposed to other taxes, why does the GFOA have that standard for counties as opposed to cities? Do they distinguish?
I don't believe that that's distinguished at all, but it's just their general recommendation, and that recommendation falls to all funds within the county, not just the general fund. We've left our other funds at 5%, but that's a excellent point that is true with the property tax stability of it. But it's opportunity to just take a look at it and just ensure that we're still meeting our future
I'm not
expectations.
disagreeing that
No,
it's
I
a prudent
understand.
policy. I'm just curious.
Yeah.
I mean, it is the most stable
Right.
source that we have. And given our predominant reliance upon property tax as opposed to the cities, and we saw what happened with a lot of our cities, in June, July. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you. A new change to this budget and financial policy that's included for consideration is that we've included the public safety fund as part of the general fund and reserve calculation. There are reasons for that. One of those reasons being that the general fund contributes 51% of its general fund discretionary reserve to the public safety fund. That's their general annual appropriation. So when those funds roll up in the CAFR at the end of the year, they're actually combined. So essentially, they are already included in our reserve that way. So we just solidified that in the language of the policy. And then we just added a little bit of clarifying language that all other non-general funds meet a minimum of 5%. This is the new language for that section 2.5.1 of the budget and financial policy. Again, it's our committed fund balance for its general reserve should be accumulated over time until a minimum of 10% of the annual operating budget is achieved. That's less capital, less contribution to reserves, and operating contingencies times 10% equals our committed fund balance. And again, just the statement that we are now including the operating costs of the public safety fund in that same calculation. So this is what that calculation actually looks like for fiscal year 2021. Total expenditures in the general fund of $340 million, in the public safety fund of $215.7, less our capital, less general fund contribution to facilities, less our operating contingency of $538 million. So 10% of that would be 53.8. Currently, in that category, in that committed fund balance, we have 49.9, or we would be $3.9 million short of reaching that 10% target at this point in time. So our recommendation would be to adopt the reserve policies as recommended, direct staff to utilize any general fund net add to fund balance at the end of this fiscal year. So that would be the general fund net revenue over expenses, and use that, and then also any future fiscal years to meet that 10% requirement. So make an effort to prioritize that for meeting that 10% goal. Section 2.5.7, this is the general fund appropriation for contingencies, and it's just a chart to show that we meet 100% of that amount of $4.8 million. So,
Pardon me, Madam Chair, real quick.
Go ahead.
Well, it's actually a question for you. Are we looking at any request for direction from our board on these recommendations today? I don't see that it's necessarily agendized that way, but
I'm sorry, Supervisor.
but when you actually phrase it as a recommendation to our board, are you thinking you will come back at a subsequent meeting with these policies for us to take action on?
So on the budget and financial policies that we're talking about here, we are the final recommendation or request for recommended approval would be to come back in December with these policies to be adopted by the board.
That was my only question, is when I have a recommendation from staff written out in front of me and I don't see it agendized as an action item, I'm wondering, okay, when are we actually going to do it? So thank you.
On the Middle Fork project revenue policy, the significant updates in this policy were we removed the reserve requirement, and we kept our separate fund dedicated to support county capital infrastructure projects. So the intent of that policy was to receive any funds from distribution of the Middle Fork Project Authority or Project Finance Authority, and use those for capital or infrastructure projects in the county. Because it's a capital fund, it doesn't require a reserve. And again, we wouldn't budget any use of those capital funds if we didn't have them available to be used. So we removed the reserve requirement and kept it in its own dedicated capital fund in the general ledger. So, and that was the updates on there. For the pension and OPEB funding policy, the discussion today on the policy itself really only had one significant update, and we adjusted how the payroll calculations or updated the process to calculate adjustments to payroll. We will have a conversation a little bit later about some general direction on OPEB and pension funding, which is in alignment with the pension and OPEB policy already. So we didn't need to make an update there, but the policy was just updated with this new process added into the end of it. On the debt management policy, we took the opportunity, since we were in the rest of the policies, just to clarify staff roles and responsibilities, and then to update our minimum bond rating requirement to be consistent with the county's current rating of AA1 by Moody's Investors. So that was the one that was in there was outdated, so we reflected the most current that we have. So our recommendation would be based on any conversation or changes or comments the board has to any of those policy changes, to bring these policies back for adoption in December for final approval.
Hey, Daniel, I have a clarification back on, I think it's slide 27, but it's the 1.5% of operating budget, right? The contingency amount.
Yeah.
So the intent is to take those funds, take 1.5% as a contingency for that current year, correct?
Correct.
So things that come up, we will set aside that amount for emergencies,
So, right.
what have you.
Yeah, it's actually appropriated in a cost center to be expended that year if needed.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify. Thank you. Any other questions? All right, go ahead.
Okay. Our next one is our PERS and OPEB discussion. So I just want to point out that the information and the data that's provided in the slides and our discussion is based on our most current actuarial reports. Our assumptions do include an annual 7% investment return rate from PERS. So, those are our baseline conversation points that we begin with.
Wasn't that adjusted down?
So in fiscal year, calendar year 2019, or fiscal year 2019-20, it was a 4.7 or 4.9% actual. So our future projections go back up to 7% and then carry through the remainder of the projection. So I don't believe we actually have an actuarial report yet that reflects the 4.9%.
No, but I thought that their assumed rate on calculating our liabilities
it was
adjusted.
reduced from 7.25 or 7.5 to 7.
Oh, I thought it was going down to 6.5.
No.
No?
Mhm.
Okay, my mistake.
I
Good.
didn't see that
Well,
one.
okay, thank you.
So starting on the OPEB side, or this is our other post-employment benefits or retiree health care. This is a page out of the actuarial report that just kind of shows how the calculation is made for what our actuarially determined contribution is for fiscal year 2021, which was the bottom number and item B in the box that says $12.2 million. So that's the amount that we need to, or that we should contribute annually. When in fact, what we've been doing is contributing upwards of $18.4 million to the OPEB, to the Surbit Trust. So the way, and for later discussion, the calculation shows the OPEB ADC of 12.2 million. And so that reduces our contribution down by 6.2 million. We do get the benefit of prepayment savings by paying those at the beginning of the fiscal year. So we don't accrue interest on some of that throughout the whole year, and saving additional about 1.8 million. So for pension funding in our when we get to that point, our suggestion would be to look at this $8 million number and kind of move that away from OPEB and into the pension funding scenario to kind of improve our funded ratio on that side. So we'll kind of get into that conversation in just a few slides. But here is our current pension funding ratios. So under our miscellaneous plan, we're funded at almost 64%. Under our safety plan, we're about 62%, or an average of 63.32%. A lot of jurisdictions talk about 80% as a good target number. So what that 80% reflects is $1.5 million, or we would be about $327 million short of reaching, or are $327 million short of reaching that 80% target. To help stabilize pension funding or annual contributions as they increase through the years. I would just want to make the note that the PARS trust is not included in our pension funded ratio calculations. Additional contributions to the PARS trust fund won't affect the unfunded liability or our funded ratio. Our current balance in that PARS trust is about $14.4 million, which reflects just 0.73% of our total liability for fiscal year 2021. So it's just a small portion of a very large number. So some of the questions that we were asking ourselves and preparing for today's workshop is, should we strive to move our funded ratio at an accelerated rate? Do we want to move the needle to 80% in less than what is already amortized to be about a 10-year process for us? So some of the options, I guess, that are available is to opt out of PERS altogether, and for a cost of a mere $3 billion. We could issue a lump sum payment to PERS of $327 million to bring that up to 80%. We can make additional contributions annually, so that $8 million a year from the OPEB calculation would reduce our time frame just down to 9 years, and then a $40 million a year injection of cash into the pension fund would bring our timeline down to 6 years. So inherently, there's a couple issues with that, which we'll touch on the next slide. But here's a graph that we did that shows those basically three scenarios. One is baseline. That's the orange line. And that would be doing nothing different than making our minimum contributions or our required contributions annually. And the gray line reflects what we call rate stabilization, which would be utilizing the PARS trust fund to stabilize our contributions at a certain level so they don't rise up to an uncontrollable amount that would come out of annual county operations revenues. And then the yellow line at the top reflects increasing our PERS contribution of $8 million a year. So you can see at the end at this graph in year 2030, there's just a 4% difference between rate stabilization. We'll be at 82% versus additional funding into the pension fund of almost 87%. So just a couple percentage points difference for an $8 million a year investment. So some of the issues with that, obviously, that's a lot of money to come up with and give cash to, and then obviously giving that to somebody else to manage that investment for us has inherent risks to it. And then we do have a situation where I believe it was 2001, the court employees who were formerly employees of the county became court employees. Well, they are still included in our pension fund, and pre-funding that any more than if they were ever to move out of our pension fund into their own, then they would could take a bigger share of any extra investment that we had in there. So some issues with making those kind of investments into the pension. So what our different idea is, or what we have for discussion today, is the concept of rate stabilization, or accelerating our funding into the PARS trust fund with the shift of OPEB net savings. So that $8 million that we saw on a previous slide. And the benefits of this is it creates a situation where we, accelerate our funding of the PARS trust with no net increase to the county budgets. And we can get to a point where our annual contribution does not exceed a certain level that the county establishes as what its comfort level is. And we have this graph to kind of demonstrate this scenario for the board. So this is just one scenario, and we, it's the same three lines. The orange line represents baseline, so doing nothing different than our current funding strategy. And in 2021, we were contributing $92 million. You can see that grow, our annual contribution growing up to 2029 and peaking at $112 million. If we were increasing our PERS contribution, that's the yellow line on top. We would see that accelerate. And then in 2029, we could be at $117 million as our annual contribution. But the rate stabilization concept is funding the PARS Trust Fund for 3 fiscal years, starting in fiscal year 21-22, and then getting to a point in fiscal year 2024 or in 2024, 2025, where we would make an annual withdrawal from the PARS Trust Fund to offset the amount between what our baseline payment wants to be. In this case, it's $99 million, and what we would actually be required to pay and to keep pace. So in that scenario in 2015 and 2025, it would go from $99 million to 106. So we would cover that gap with a withdrawal or payment out of the PARS Trust Fund. So essentially stabilizing our rate at $99 million for 10 years to come. And that's, just one scenario, and the years can move and we can switch, or we could take a look at it, at doing it at the 103 or the $102 million point, and start in having those calculations done differently. But in any case, this all begins with accelerating the funding of the PARS Trust Fund in next fiscal year in 21-22, with that about $8 million a year.
And does this assume that $8 million contribution continues through this entire period that you have illustrated here?
No, it includes the contribution for the first 3 years, and then we start actually pulling money out of the reserve.
Okay.
So it's a net decrease to the reserve fund.
What is the total reduction in contribution that you are making on an annualized basis at that point?
So the total difference would be between our baseline and then the stabilization line. So in fiscal year, or in 2025, that would be $7 million savings to the county. In 2028, that would be $12 million.
And what is happening? We don't have a fourth line, which might be good, but what's happening at that point in terms of percentage funded of the total liability? Do we, so in this scenario where we peak in 2029, what percentage funded are we of our unfunded liability right now?
It's the previous slide. It's the same 3 scenarios.
So in 2029, you're saying we're at 85%?
We would, under rate stabilization in 2025, we would be at 73%.
Okay, so I'm looking at the gray line.
Yeah, the gray line in 2025 would be at 73%.
No, it was I'm sorry, what year was it? Well, it was 2029 where
Right.
we peaked
So you'll be
in the
a little over
contribution.
80.
So in 2029 on this one, we would be right about 80%.
You're at 80, and that's when you anticipate the further reduction in the contribution.
Right, and then our contribution in the PARS Trust Fund would go down to about like an annual contribution of 2.5 million, or something similar to what we're doing today.
Okay. Either here or in subsequent slides, is there a recommendation as to what to do with that money if we do follow this course?
In the far out years when we reach 80%, or the recommendation
when we start drawing from the PARS Trust, and in the first year our difference is $7 million. Do you have a recommendation as to what to do with that $7 million?
No, that would be an annual budget workshop discussion where we would identify that additional resource available for additional board priorities or capital projects, or it's all discretionary revenue. It would be up to the board's discretion on how they wanted to allocate those funds.
Okay.
Before you spend it.
Right.
There's a few assumptions
Right.
that are so challenging for local agencies. And that is, what is the PERS return on investment during this time? And that is just such a wild card, because I've sat through 30 years where I've watched it based on they expect 7% returns. They net, what did you say,
It was 4.7% or 4.9%.
4.7 this year. So I think that's the variable that we can do all this rate stabilization planning, and we should. But in the end, it's going to be based on what the investments return on those accounts, correct?
Correct.
And then even though Placer County could be as as stable as possible, it may not affect. Where are other counties? You said the goal was to get to 80%. What other jurisdictions are currently at 80%, or where are we in the funding matrix as far as our PERS?
Yeah, so we were able to sample a couple counties. We did get a sample from Nevada County.
Mhm.
Their miscellaneous is currently at 63.6%. Their safety tier 1 is at 70%, and their safety tier 2 is almost 93% on the pension side.
Mhm.
Yolo County is miscellaneous at 66.1 and 66.3 for safety. Solano County was 71.5 and 73.9 for safety. So we're not out of the norm, but we're not ahead of or
But
really
we're on the
behind anybody
lower,
else.
yeah, we're
Okay.
lower than our surrounding counties. And what
Any idea
about,
where they are on their OPEB?
On the OPEB for the same counties, Nevada County is at 46%, Yolo County at 14%, and Solano County was 65%.
And
We are at 95% on OPEB.
Yeah.
Essentially.
and then you didn't mention El Dorado County?
Right. Yeah.
On purpose. But you can get those numbers for me?
If you'd like. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Sure. Sorry. So our requested action today would be to get direction from the board to begin implementing that strategy in fiscal year 21-22. So when we return to the board for budget discussions in March and April, May, June, to have that considered as part of our funding strategy and shown in the budget documents as so. Okay. So now we'll move into our conditions of our major operating funds. And at this time, I'd like Jeremy and the IT staff to load the Excel onto the monitors, please. Okay. Can I get this one back? I want the PowerPoint on the big projector and Excel on just the monitors, please. Thank you. Okay, so the funds that we'll be reviewing today: General Fund, Public Safety Fund, HHS, Library, Fire Protection, a little bit on Capital and the Road Fund. Some of the assumptions that are built into the models that we'll be talking about this morning are, an accounting for possibility of reduced growth in property tax revenue. So not a reduction in actual property tax receipts, but just a reduction in the growth factor. Fiscal year 2021 has been adjusted in these models for expected decline in sales tax revenues. Most of our other revenues are being held flat at this point. On the expenditure side, we do forecast salaries and benefits to reflect annual growth projections. Our pension and OPEB costs are matched to our most recent actuarial reports. We do inflate the operational costs, and then our transfers to other county funds are recognize the same assumptions. So as the general fund increases, if it's a percentage of the general fund is transferred to public safety, that does increase as well. We have left out any CARES and COVID-related costs and revenues from the model at this point in time, mostly just due to the fact that it would almost all be a wash as we increase the expenditures for the actual receipts that they're spending and we reimburse them for that. It would just wash the dollars back to zero. So we've left those out now as we still are spending some of those dollars and calculating how much we're actually spending. So on the first slide, so just we'll talk about general fund, and I want to point out that the slide that's in your in the presentation here and in your packet looks a little different than what's on the monitors right now, and really the only difference is what we've put at the top of the expenditure bar in a kind of a goldenrod color, which reflects capital expenses compared to total expenses and revenue. So you can see the difference there, and hopefully be easier to identify where capital is causing a use of fund balance versus operational costs. So that's the main difference in there. But what we wanted to be able to do today is either entertain any conversation or ideas from the board, and we can actually work those into our model live, and you can see the changes being made to the revenue and expenditure targets and the fund balance on your monitors. It won't change in the slide presentation because that's just a static slide. But for the general fund, going back one slide, just as a leading slide into this, property taxes represent 72% of the overall revenue for the general fund, and salaries and benefits represent 58% of our operational costs. And this slide reflects basically our current status quo, what we are projecting for fiscal year 2021, which is different than the budget amount, and then ongoing with the assumptions that we've built in through fiscal year 2025-26. So you can see on this chart in the fund balance line ending in fiscal year 2021 at 119 million. That's total fund balance, and that includes all of our commitments and assignments for capital reserve, our PARS trust, general reserves, et cetera. You can see that dropping down in fiscal year 21-22 to 96 million. But at the top of that expenditure bar, you can see a total expenses of 361 million, but $32 million in capital expenses. So that is designed to incorporate some previous discussions and previous approvals for general capital reserve funding of capital projects. And in 21-22, the majority of that would be the HHS admin building of $19 million. So that's how we reflected that. And you can see that carry through. And then again, another large increase in capital reserve use in fiscal year 23-24. And then that kind of stabilizes in 24-25 and 25-26 as the bigger expenditures and the reserves drop out of the projection. So for the live demonstration here, we're going to go ahead and increase one project that's been discussed, but that is not reflected because it doesn't have everything all tidied up and neat and clean yet. Just to so you can see on the monitors what happens when we program another $10 million, if you will, out of the capital reserves into our program. So in fiscal year 24-25 was an additional $10 million that moved from the capital reserves into the general fund budget, essentially. So that would move over into the capital fund for a $10 million effort. And you can see our overall ending fund balance decreasing then down to $69 million from a point where it was essentially $10 million higher. So we have the ability in this model, if there's any conversation the board wants to entertain about the general fund and the model itself and how we program these assumptions and doing different pieces of this, we can add costs in, we can change assumptions, and it will all reflect on what we would project the general fund to be doing over the next 5 years.
So one of the things that I asked for back when Holly Heinzen was doing this stuff for us, I just think it would be a fun exercise. We know that we are looking at a $14 million investment in moving the Placer Ranch project forward and helping deliver the sewer and the roadway, I believe, to the university property. I think it would be interesting to look at what kind of an upfront investment would really open up our best tax rate area in the Sunset Industrial area. Assume an absorption rate in consultation with our friends at GSEC or whatever. Assume an absorption rate that they think would be stable and predictable based on the combination of infrastructure being available and the PCCP being in place, reduction in permitting time and all the rest, and just come up with a calculation that says if we invested X in the Sunset Industrial area to open up our best tax rate areas, and it absorbed at this kind of a rate, then in 10 years, have we paid back that capital investment? Plus, what are we generating additionally beyond what it would otherwise do absent our upfront capital investment? I really think with the combination of the conservation plan and the adoption by this board of the Sunset Industrial Area Plan, we have the opportunity to see some significant investment. And again, I don't know if Sherry's not here, but I think having a good conversation, if you were to sit, for instance, with Barry Broom of GSEC, he's going to tell you that today the biggest problem that he has is they don't have stuff they can move on quickly. And he could be capturing good employers at 500 to 700 to 1,000 jobs at a time looking for campus opportunities if we have that combination. If you have stuff that has infrastructure relatively available, but driving down the permitting time, of course, is really the key for this stuff. So I think that would be a really fun exercise to say, all right, if we push forward with it, getting money in the ground, getting investment in the ground based on this absorption in this tax rate area, here's what that would yield in a 50-year horizon, that kind of a thing. So just because I like playing around with silly stuff like that.
Well, I know a few people that like to do the same kind of analysis, so.
Good.
Be happy to help.
I had a question on your projections on property tax growth. Is that like 3% a year, 2.7%? Is that what you're?
So we have it modeled in different for different years. So currently in our updated projections for fiscal year 2021, I believe it's 5.4% growth.
Mhm.
In fiscal year 21-22, we've reduced that down to 4% or 4.5%. And then it kind of levels off down to a 3% level in the fiscal years 25, 26, 26, 27, and that far out. So
I'm looking at what we went through in 2008, 9, 10. It seems relatively optimistic.
well,
I mean, given how long we've been on this track and the fact that at least in home territory for me, a lot of people are wondering how long can we sustain that kind of
growth.
that investment that we're seeing people make right now.
Yeah, and that's I think why we've been fairly cautious in the out years. Right up front in our current fiscal year, that is an increase from what we had modeled at this time last year.
Mm-hmm.
And then so we're acknowledging what we're really seeing on the ground, and then not going too far off from that for next year, because those indicators in the real estate market would reflect that we should see some significant growth there as well. But in those further out years, in a very different economic environment than the Great Recession for us currently with the sales tax impacts, but
Right.
property
Especially
tax
if we
level.
see any kind of downturn in commercial real estate or in office space, those sorts
Right.
of things. I mean, certainly the optimist says new projects may come in, but how does that affect? And then on salaries and benefits, your assumption was that they would remain at 58% of whatever those revenues were. Is that how you're?
No, the lead slide was just really just some high points, kind of the biggest
That's what it is
operational cost
today,
area.
but
That's
you
the
had to
cost
make
today.
some assumptions for,
Right, and
for
so we
those out years.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Supervisor. We escalate that up based on whether there's an existing general wage increase on the books. We have an existing MOU for a
Right.
2% this year and a 1%. So we'll escalate those up. We look at the benefits costs and the other employment costs like that, and we escalate those up each year.
And assumed some sort of CPI on, is that? your
On
base?
the operational costs, we
Yeah.
have, I believe it's 2.5% that's built into the model right now for the operational costs.
Okay, thank you.
Questions? Okay. So moving to their next fund is the Public Safety Fund. And just a reminder, Public Safety Fund consists of the District Attorney's Office, Probation, and the Sheriff, Coroner, Marshal Department. The general fund appropriation to the Public Safety Fund represents 60% of their overall revenue. Public safety sales tax and other intergovernmental revenues, or state contracts, grants, those types of things represent 34% of their revenue. Salaries and benefits represent 71% of their overall operational costs. So the projections for Public Safety Fund, again, on the projection screen reflect our newest 2021 adjustments or projections, which includes the reduction in sales tax or public safety sales tax revenue to them. And again, you can see at the top of their expenditure bar, $3.6 million worth of capital assets that are in that budget. I will point out that some of their capital asset expenses are actually vehicle replacements. So while you can consider them a capital asset, they are an operational cost as well. They are also required to replace vehicles at a certain point in time per their MOUs. So those really could be considered an operational cost rather than a capital cost. But overall, for fiscal year 2021, you can see the revenue at $212.4 million, and then total expenses at $217. So there would be a use of reserves to cover that gap. The majority of that, or some of that, is on the capital side and would be coming from their capital reserves in their specific fund. However, in the out years, starting in fiscal year 21-22, which assumes a slight increase in public safety sales tax, but certainly not to the levels that we saw in fiscal years 18-19. Some recovery there, and dropping down their expenditure target on capital side, but their total expenses rise to $222.6 million compared to $220 million of revenue. So we see a trend starting here that worsens as the years go on, where the operational costs will start exceeding their operational revenue. And then, the course corrections that are already applied from the different departments in the Public Safety Fund are to really monitor their discretionary costs and their discretionary expenses to reduce those down to not only meet their budget amount, but also to meet their revenue projections as well. So in fiscal year 19-20, that did happen. You can see on the chart that their fund balance hardly moved from fiscal year 18-19 to 19-20. While we did have some capital expenditures in there, I think the cost cutting and the cost management on the operational side really reduced that to the point where they weren't really digging into their reserves to cover operational costs. But in the future, that won't always be the case. And in this case, we're projecting it off of no net increase in programs. So as on your board agenda for December 1st, I think is body worn cameras and a discussion to that. So we can actually plug that model in, or that assumption in, that there would be a need to fund that in the Public Safety Fund. And so Daniel's doing that for us right now. And you can see what happens to the fund balance trend line, where we are dropping to a negative position in fiscal year 21-22 already. So just the introduction of one program element like that at about $1 million a year has a compounding effect on the out years as well, barring a new revenue source to accommodate that request.
Sure, Gore. Question. Could you go back to slide 50, please? Salaries and benefits represent 71% of operational costs for public safety. Do you know if we're in line with other jurisdictions? Is that average, or are we ahead of other jurisdictions as far as salaries and benefits for public safety?
Supervisor Holmes, we did not do that comparison for the public safety salaries and benefits. I don't know if Becky might know that off the top of her head. No.
Okay. That would just be interesting to know. Okay, thank you.
And as long as we're asking those questions, I'd also be interested in what percentage of general fund is going into public safety in those other jurisdictions,
okay.
right? Because that's where you're making up that difference.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no other questions on this one, we'll move to the Health and Human Services Fund. So in the Health and Human Services Fund, general fund appropriation represents 18% of their revenue. Sales tax and other intergovernmental revenues account for 76%. Their salary and benefits represent 43% of their overall operational costs. And so the chart for Health and Human Services, it grows year over year, and it's generally in balance every year, and they are flat on their ending fund balance line of $6 million, which was the $6 million that moved to the HHS fund from the general fund, which was called the mandated reserves. So when we moved them out of the general fund, we moved that $5 million reserve with them. But essentially, HHS, for lack of a better description, operates in a balanced budget mode. They're appropriated a dollar amount of general fund needed to balance their budget. At the end of the year, they only take in as much as they need to cover their general fund costs that aren't reimbursed from the state and other contracts and grants and different revenue sources that way. So projecting that out, we would consider them fairly flat and stable through the out years, considering the model stay the same. So, but again, we can build in different assumptions if anybody wants to see anything on HHS. Okay, going on. The library fund, 23% of its revenue is from the general fund. That's a $1.8 million annual contribution to the library fund. Taxes and other intergovernmental revenues represent 74% of their revenue. And so those would increase as our property tax values increase as well. Salaries and benefits represent 64% of their operational costs. And on their chart, in 1920, you can see a pretty sizable reduction, or a decent reduction, down to $7.76 million of actual expenses compared to $8.2 million in revenue. A lot of that to do with unprecedented vacancy rates at the end of fiscal year 1920 and starting into 2021 in the library, as well as their current operating model led to some decreases in expenditures, which we would expect at some point to pick back up and go back higher to more of the budgeted numbers. But in fiscal year 2021, you can see the revenue increase up from last year of about $210,000, and increase in expenditures increasing. $500,000 increase was basically a rebudget of some capital expenditures that weren't done in fiscal year 1920, as well as some other capital efforts that they have through the program through their 5-year model to update their technology and their facilities and different pieces of the capital equation. So right now their fund balance is stable, around the $2 million mark, and that rolls through as they become less reliant on their reserves to meet their operational needs, and even their capital needs as well. So this assumes a flat general fund appropriation of $1.8 million throughout the remainder of the model.
Sure. I have a question, Daniel. Several years ago, the Loomis Library went into the town of Loomis, and so we're not paying the expenses on that facility. Do we have any idea how much savings was accrued in the library fund over the last few years by closing that library?
I don't have those right now. Be happy to get them for you.
Okay, appreciate it.
Okay. Okay, our next fund would be the fire fund, or the fire control fund. I just want to make a couple leading statements here. So we were only going to be talking about the fire control fund today, and the projections only model that, not the zones of benefit within the fire services program in Placer Fire. The general fund contributes about 39% of its overall revenue. Property taxes and charges represent 44% of the revenue, and the majority of all their expenses is related to the CAL FIRE contract for all the support that they provide us. The model on the fire fund chart looks daunting in fiscal year 23, 24, and in the out years, as we get to a point where where we've exhausted our ending fund balance and our reserves to maintain pace on our operational costs and equipment and capital needs. For fiscal year 2021, you can see that there's a sizable or $390,000 worth of capital costs that are included in their $5.8 million worth of total expenditures against $5.3 million of revenues. And so there'd be a use of fund balance here to cover those capital costs as well. And then you can see that trend kind of projecting out as revenue decreases in fiscal year 21-22. That is because of the one-time additional general fund appropriation that the board approved for the fire fund last year during the budget workshop. So we, instead of the normal $1,098,000 that's given to the fire fund, we increased that to $2,098,000 for fiscal year 2021. Included in that was the use of funding the fire marshal position, some equipment, and then help stabilize the funds overall. So that was included there. The model does project that is reduced back down to the baseline $1,098,000 in fiscal year 21-22 and beyond. And Daniel will plug in into the model the additional $1 million if it's in the board's interest to do so, to see what that would do to the fire fund overall in those fiscal years going outwards. Did you update? So you can see that investment in the fire fund stabilizes their fund balance into a positive situation and really helps cover a lot of their operational costs, in the out years as we work through the fire ad hoc and the subsequent committees on a long-term funding program for fire services in the county. But that is where we are currently landing on fire fund. Don't have any fancy slides for capital fund or any fancy graphs. The capital fund really exists to provide the funding mechanism, the planning development mechanism of a lot of our capital projects in the county. The long-term budget perspective is determined by the projects that are approved and the identifiable funding sources that go into those, which can include the general fund capital reserves. And the general fund would only really be impacted after a board decision to increase the general fund capital reserves to fund any specific project. So right now in the general fund model that we talked about, the first slide in, these are the projects that are currently included in that model for funding, and then the fiscal year that we would expect to see those contributions being made. So you can see the HHS admin building at almost $19 million contribution out of capital reserves in fiscal year 21-22. The Atherton tenant improvements in the same fiscal year of about $7 million. The Placer Parkway project, $20 million in fiscal year 23-24. Crime Lab in Burton Creek, $6.2 million and 10.6 estimated numbers in 24-25. So those are the same amounts that are included in the first slide for the general fund. We do, again, have the flexibility to add in any additional costs or any additional projects so you can see how that affects the general fund and the ending fund balance and capital reserves if the board wishes to do that. But otherwise, these are the ones that are currently programmed, and most of all these have been discussed before the board on prior occasions.
The tenant improvements for the Atherton project, this may be coming at our next item. Is there any indication of whether they're on track, or is there an overage of expenses on that? Do we know yet? Or maybe this be something we can ask in the next time.
Your director of facilities gave you a thumbs up.
Oh, okay. That's what I wanted to hear or see.
Okay. So moving on to the road fund, again, no pretty charts to go with this one. The general fund does contribute $3.8 million a year annually to the road fund as a maintenance of effort for the county to receive their gas tax and SB1 revenues. Gas tax revenues support road maintenance and construction activities, and their budget does fluctuate year over year depending on their project scopes, as well as the funding available to meet those objectives. We did have touched base with Public Works on a couple occasions about some of the funding related to gas tax, knowing that fuel usage was down due to COVID and more people teleworking or not working and not driving as much. And a lot of those monies are used as, contributions and discretionary revenue to projects. So as those revenues perhaps might reduce, the scope of that work would reduce in lieu of and essentially balance out that way without, dipping into reserves and things like that. So that's how the road fund is operating with their general fund appropriation. And that was the extent of the conversation on the major operating funds and the current position and projections for those. Again, we have the ability to now or at any point in today's presentation to go back and revisit any of those slides and any of the models and remodel anything that the board wishes to include in there. With no questions for that now, we'll go on to budget development policies for fiscal year 21-22.
I just had one other point on the road fund in particular. We know there's going to be pretty dramatic changes in gas tax and where we're headed in VMT versus gas tax and how we're going to charge for roads and if we go to all electric vehicles. So to me, that's just a footnote that we need to keep reminding ourselves how dramatically that fund may change and what may happen as a result of other governmental policy changes. So. It needs to be somehow footnoted and reminded as we move forward that it's another moving variable that we're not in control of.
Right. Okay, so moving into our budget development policies for fiscal year 21-22. Just as a side note to that, last year we sat here and suggested a whole slew of different changes, and through the course of the budget development year, we had COVID, jumped in and kind of adjusted our internal timelines about developing budgets and department presentations. But overall, we met a lot of those objectives. We did adopt our final budget in June instead of September as we had done in the past. So I just wanted to touch on that quickly, but the ideas for today, very similar to last year, just one new topic, which is the supplemental requests and how we would propose to treat those in the next fiscal year's budget. But starting with the fund transfers, our current fiscal year 2021 general fund contributions is public safety received $130.1 million. That is based on 51% of general fund contingency revenue. So as property taxes increase, that would also increase similarly. Health and Human Services budgeted for $42.4 million. And again, theirs is, that's the high water mark for the year at the budget time. And then as the actual revenues and expenses come through, we do one transfer at the end of the year for the actual amount that they need to balance their general fund operations. Library is a flat general fund contribution of $1.8 million. The road fund, again, at $3.77 million is flat. Capital does vary from year to year. We do, on an annual basis, contribute $4.5 million for Placer County Government Center maintenance costs. And then as the capital needs exist, we make additional transfers out of capital reserves to help support those projects that they have to complete. And then fire for this fiscal year at $2,089,000. And that is a flat amount. It was increased one time for this fiscal year to $2 million, and it's generally $1 million or $1.1 million. So our recommendations for budget development in 21-22, anticipating where we think property tax and an assumption that we would see growth in that area would be to maintain our current level of general fund support for the road fund and library fund. So our two flat amount transfers. Maintain our current appropriation methodology for Health and Human Services. So just treat that the same, adjust for one-time expenses as need be, or address any needs that they have above and beyond that. But to have some conversation or receive recommendation from the board on how to, whether to contribute differently to public safety and or the fire fund based on today's workshop. So you saw, for example, on the public safety fund side, kind of where their projection is headed, barring no changes to revenues and different patterns in expenditures. And you saw where the fire fund was also kind of heading in the same trajectory downwards to a use of fund balance. So we would entertain any discussion from the board on whether or not they would anticipate funding the fire fund at a higher level, or a different calculation for public safety for the next budget year, or we would just assume status quo until we submit budgets for 21-22.
Well, I think from the ad hoc perspective and our workshop, that we need to continue the fire fund until we have arrived at and I think we're looking at 2 years, right?
At least 2 years, yeah.
2 years additional on that. On the general fund contribution to public safety, obviously, this is one that we're taking a lot of public scrutiny over. And I guess, you know, what I've been telling constituents is that we're trying to curb that growth in taking from our general fund for the public safety fund. And so I'd like to see that reflected in some manner. So the assumptions moving forward, not only this year, but in future years, are to hold that at a rate that is more reflective. But that's where I need the comparisons to the other entities, I think would be helpful in setting a fair and equitable policy, because Measure F compares us to these other counties. What are they doing and how is their general fund being impacted? Because I think that would be indicative of a way to approach this. That's just my thoughts.
I have a quick question about the library fund.
Yeah.
So salary increases for those employees, does that basically come out of the amount that they receive for the special library funds, right? There's special funds that directly go to the library, correct?
Correct.
So basically those salary increases would be addressed by those funds, and then we're just augmenting that same flat amount, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? All right, thoughts?
Okay. The next balanced budget development policy. So again, this last year we made a significant effort to balance the fiscal year 2021 budget expenditures to the new revenue that we anticipated coming in. There were a couple areas where we funded from reserves essentially, but not included in that new budgeted revenue. But we wanted to, expand on that this year and really, make that a go forward budget policy that we are budgeting, new year expenses with the new year revenue targets. And any variation from that where we need to rely on reserves for one-time, which should really only be used for one-time expenses, which is the way it's written in the budget and financial policy. But any exceptions to those things are clearly presented to the board for consideration during the budget hearings, that these are the places where revenue was insufficient to cover operational expenses, and whether there's a recommendation to cover that with reserve funds or some other source. Vacancy savings, again, the county, we ran the number again last week, averaging nearly 7% for annual vacancy savings across the board. The fiscal year 2021 budget does include a 4% countywide salary savings mark. And, we certainly understand that not all departments are in the same boat as this, but to build the budget out, we do this across the board. And then just, we kind of work through that and true those departments up as we go through the year. But it does produce a budget that really is truer to our actual year-end salary costs when we do realize a lot of those same vacancy savings throughout the year. So we're just requesting affirmation to continue with that for the fiscal year 21-22 budget, and see no need to go away from that model. The last development policy for discussion is supplemental requests. So these are items that are not included in departmental base budgets that are submitted to our office along with their base budgets. For this fiscal year, when we took these in March timeframe, there were 134 supplemental requests that totaled nearly $51.5 million. Of those requests, it was a request for ongoing general fund support of $20.8 million. So that would have been the first year of a multi-year funding had we approved any or all of those. But after we had some deletions and then the initial deferral process because of the COVID dynamic, 26 requests totaling $5.6 million were recommended to your board for funding during the final budget back in June. And that was a $3.1 million increase in the general fund spending for that fiscal year. What we are proposing is to not eliminate the submission of supplemental requests, but just to give it a different timeline and a different context with which to review those supplemental requests. So first of all, and this would be a change, which would be reviewing supplemental requests in the first quarter of the new fiscal year. So rather than doing that in the midst of developing the balanced base budget, this would give us an opportunity to actually see ending revenue and expenditures for the prior fiscal year, whether there was any revenue that or fund balance add, net revenue add to fund balance that exceeded our estimated projections from earlier in the fiscal year, and be able to weigh those against really not new money necessarily, but not fund balance either. But we would consider ongoing costs only with an identified sustainable revenue source. So again, looking at those to not use fund balance and reserves to fund ongoing expenditures. We consider supplemental requests after we've met our reserve requirements. And then again, just another nail in there for reserves will not be used for ongoing costs. So again, that's in alignment with the county budget and financial policy. So we would just be asking for board direction to review and recommend supplemental requests based on those criteria above, doing that in first quarter and using some actual carryover numbers to estimate what we have available for supplemental requests. And that was it for development policies. Right now, our budget development timeline, it looks like this with a lot of unknown dates in there. And we'll be waiting for the board's adoption of their calendar year 2021 board meeting schedule to fill in some of the blanks. But we started again this year on November 10th with today's budget workshop. We'll anticipate bringing department budget presentations to your board in March. Public hearing in the first part of June, and followed by final budget adoption by the board in late June, occurring 2 weeks after the public hearing. With that, we have a summary of the requested actions. And so one is to bring proposed financial policy updates back to your board for final approval in December. To go ahead and begin implementing the PARS funding strategy of moving that excess money from the OPEB side, the $8 million approximately, and funding the PARS trust fund with that. To appropriate our general fund transfers as requested, which I understand would be very similar to fiscal year 2021, with the exception of or actually with including fire fund receiving an additional $1 million for fiscal year 21-22, bringing their total general fund to $2 million. And then to revisit the public safeties appropriation at some point in the future based on some follow-up conversations and some analysis of similar costing and funding ratios from neighboring counties. And if I got that right, was the request there. We would be working on balancing our new year budget to new revenue. We would be including our 4% vacancy savings in all the budgets across the county in their base budget, implement the new process for supplemental requests and review of, and then finally prepare and submit our final budget to occur in June 2021, as we did in this fiscal year. And with that, that concludes the slide presentation. And if there's any final thoughts from the board or any other to-do list items that you'd like us to take on, we'd be happy to hear those or answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Daniel. Appreciate it very much. Let's see, Supervisor Wygant and then Supervisor Holmes.
Yeah, first of all, compliment you guys on some great work. And I love the what if types of things that you're plugging in for us to be able to see, contemplate potentially as we sit here. But I'd only just really endorse what Cindy and Kirk said. So on the public safety fund and the fire fund, we think we have this expectation that the fire fund will be dealing with a 2-year what I'll describe as being resolution to knowing and having a plan for being able to sustain that budget based on what we know going forward in perpetuity. I think we need to do the same exact thing with the public safety fund and have those kinds of frank and candid conversations. We are obviously trying to deal with part of that, a big part of that as it relates to public discussions, some of which we're getting some pretty good heat for. But at the end of the day, we have long had a policy of having our ongoing revenues be used for ongoing expenses and not trying to backfill when we get ongoing revenues to sustain in the short run ongoing expenses. And I think we just need to emphasize that and make that real clear. And as it relates to the schedules and the final slide you had before this one, I'm perfectly comfortable with everything you put up there.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, and one last thing on Kirk's side. The SIA, of course, is near and dear to my heart, but that kind of analysis and that kind of work, I strongly endorse it. Some of that, I think we would want to look at as being more speculative. So, but in that we have had good budget policies and have been able to enjoy the luxury of considering those kinds of things, it has resulted in the county coming up with funding partnerships, for example, with the United Auburn Indian Community regarding the Parkway. We've been able to do some incentivization of the development of the SIA with Placer Ranch. And I think it'd be really worth our while to look at what would happen to our revenue projections particularly with property tax if we were in fact to make some of those investments. You know, we'd have to consider the fact that the absorption is not always going to be exactly what we predict, and some of it's going to be speculative, but it's within that margin that I think we can strategically make decisions that actually make a huge difference in how we look 10 and 20 years down the road.
Okay.
But in the face of better employment numbers and higher disposable income and generally a higher quality of life.
Okay.
Anything else for? Anything else so far?
Well, if you want me to give you your time, I'll take it. Sure.
First of all, Daniel, thank you so much for this very robust presentation, and it's good to see the CEO budget analysts in the room today. We don't see them very often anymore. Mr. Wade, Mr. Vick, Ms. McAllister, the newest one, and then of course Mr. Finstermacher. So thank you for all your hard work on this. It's really a good way to move forward if our planning. As far as the fire fund, it's going to be a challenge over the next 2 years, but I'm very confident that we can work together to increase those revenues from some of those zones of benefits. So we will be working diligently on that over the next 2 years. And otherwise, it was a good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Holmes. Anything else from the two of y'all?
Yeah, I had a couple comments. One is on the supplemental requests. I really appreciate where we're going, but I don't want to stand in the way of innovation. So for instance, if we had a reason to consider a supplemental request that may manifest itself with ongoing revenues, we certainly want to be approached with those ideas for innovation and changes in our operation. So I just wanted to make that clear to anyone listening. We're always open to innovation and streamlining and being more efficient and effective. And then as it relates to the sunset area and looking at some of that modeling, I think that's important because I get hit all too often with growth and development questions. How does this benefit us as constituents? And really making that case for, you know, status quo, what's happening with our costs at status quo without any new investment or development. And so I think it is important to do some level, again, footnoted with it's speculative, and but what we can assume is without much growth where we're headed. So, and I think that's some of what's happened in the zones of benefit and the fire fund and other areas. So I think it's really important for our local constituents to understand status quo is not status quo. their quality of life and their services can't continue at a level without other investments. So I appreciate you, as you have time with this very ambitious calendar for developing a budget, to take some baseline assumptions that we can use. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Great. Well, and thank you very much. I don't think I have anything else to add that's already been said, other than we really appreciate the work and really appreciate the opportunity to look at the budget now, before you build the entire thing for this next fiscal year. So thank you so much, and we'll hear back from you, I guess,
Soon.
next year. Oh my, no, actually, no, December. You said December you'll come back with policies, correct?
Correct.
Oh, public comment. Thank you. Public comment. So anybody in the public like to add a comment, input, thoughts on the presentation? No. All right. Well, you can always hit us up later. Not in public. Okay. With that, we'll close this item, and then we're going to move to the capital facility planning workshop. I need to take 5 minutes. So we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll start back here at, I don't know, what, 11:10. Yes. 6 minutes. All right, we're going to move to our facilities, our capital facilities planning workshop, and we're going to talk about future capital needs. So good morning, Paul. Nice to see you.
Good morning, Chair.
We'll let you take it away.
Thank you. With me today is Genevieve Vargas, Senior Architect with Capital Improvements. And we do have Steve Newsom and Lori Morris from Facilities Management as well. So we are now moving to the, with the two architects here, we're moving to the more graphics presentation. So we're moving from the accountants and the less graphic slides. So we've got lots of graphics to go through with you here today. We're very pleased to be here, and kind of the quick overview, the bigger idea for the meeting today is, we'll touch on the 5-year capital improvements plan, the 5-year plan, and give you an update on the projects there, let you know where we're at, because we are making, I think, some great, fantastic progress on all fronts. And then really the biggest component of the presentation is with the HHS Center and Atherton facility coming up, and it's their improvements that we're going to free up space both here at CDRC, upstairs where HHS and Admin and Public Health are, and then at the Fab across the parking lot here, where we've got quite a bit of considerable amount of square footage that's going to free up over the next few years too. So bigger questions for that. What are the potential options to best utilize these assets and for, to continue our services and functions? When they do become available, are there efficiencies and project cost savings that can be found with the options? And what are the impacts of the space availability to the current implementation of the PCGC master plan, which at the time when your board approved it, we really didn't have kind of this notion of Atherton and the movement of clerk recorder election down to the Rockland area. So obviously that's kind of changed the mix in the discussion since it was approved. So the agenda today will be talking about some of the background and where we've been to date with your board and the approvals. Space usage with the upcoming projects that was just mentioned, and then some concepts. So as we look at some options, we've spent a lot of time internally with staff, CEO, and all the different departments and divisions that are affected by these moves to see if we're kind of headed in the right direction, at least conceptually. So we've spent a lot of time, a lot of homework to get to this point for the concepts that we're going to show today. And then we do have some potential next steps as we ask for your board's feedback. What are those things that we want to do moving ahead if this seems like a good direction? So for the 5-year facilities plan, last year, Steve and CEO, the board had the planning workshop in March. The follow-up with kind of that notion of those tier 1 projects happened in November. And of course, the master plan happening in 2019 And we will be talking a little bit about Griffin Swinnerton, who is our current partner right now with looking at feasibility for both private development at the PCGC and potentially at Fulweiler too. And then just a quick blurb on the Mercy Housing Project that as our first private project out of the ground, which, as you know, is coming up right now, which are 79 affordable housing units here just down the street. So we're pleased to have that underway. So kind of this notion of private development on the campus and to the east side of the campus is happening. And so as we get further into the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about that. And we're looking to have that finished in 2021. So we're very proud of the project and look forward to that being completed. HHS, as you all know, on the last board meeting, your board approved the stipends for the non-winning competition teams for the HHS design build process. And then your board obviously provided the direction on the acquisition. And on October 6th, your board provided direction on the architectural services. So we are moving swiftly with the tenant improvement planning for Atherton. So as far as that in 2019, so there was that review and prioritization of capital projects. Lots of options and budget implications that Daniel alluded to earlier. So really what came out of that were the notion of the tier 1 and 2 projects. And I've just highlighted the bigger ones here with HHS, Tahoe Justice Center, the replacement there, and mainly the kind of the site identification. So let's nail down the site in which we're going to make that replacement. We feel pretty good about the progress to date at Burton Creek, the crime lab, and then the county admin building, which was in that tier 1, but didn't necessarily make it to the kind of the funding plan component of the 5-year plan, but was definitely meant to be that replacement for the domes and annex here across the street for those uses at Fulweiler. So as we're looking at the master plan, that's always been talked about in as part of the master plan. So we're here today to look at some potential concepts that differ from that. And then moving ahead with the design and construction of the and then I think I covered most of the HHS update there, but we've been talking to the board for quite some time about that through the master plan, and now through we're into the phase 2 process. And we're looking to move through our confidential meetings, December, January, February, to meet with the teams. So our HHS, CEO, facilities management meeting with those teams to come up with best solutions, best value projects that we'll bring back to the board as a recommendation, most likely in April of next year. So just a quick update on some of these facilities under the CIP, Tahoe Justice Center. So we're right in the middle of kind of finalizing our soils and hydrology reporting for that water table depth and our ability to go back and identify usable area for what would be a replacement there. And we're making some great progress. We've got a great consultant that's helping us with that identification. And we're very close to hearing back from TRPA on kind of the final kind of approach to what they consider usable area, depth. We're looking at potentially maybe needing some fill in some certain area, but we're getting closer to a point which we can determine that Burton Creek is a good potential for our replacement for our Justice Center. And please, on any of these, break in, and if you've got questions, please let me know.
I do have a question on that one. Are we anticipating moving the DPW storage off the site?
That was the original intent. So for the upper part of the site, that was the original intent, was to utilize that area for part of the Justice Center. Mm-hmm. We do have some, as we've furthered the planning process, there are still probably some needs for equipment that we needed that location to maintain access for them in the basin.
Yes.
So changing blades and other things.
Right.
So we have talked about that. So we will be considering that as we move through the process.
There's some other efforts going on, and I know Peter Kratz is aware of those, but it's also looking at the needs for the Caltrans 'Trans' yard at the Y and those sorts of things. So I'd love to see, you know, some of the efforts going on, and I know Peter Kratz is aware of those, but it's also looking at the needs for the Caltrans yard at the Y and those sorts of things. So I'd love to see, you know, some of the efforts going on, and I know Peter Kratz is aware of those, but it's also looking at the needs for the Caltrans yard at the Y and those sorts of things. So I'd love to see what we can do jointly if we
Okay.
need to move this, because this is such a critical project for that facility at Burton Creek. Thanks.
Absolutely. Okay, we'll do that. Crime Lab project, we have ongoing discussions. So really it's dependent on, where we end up in the furtherance of Placer Ranch and what's going on there. But I know CEO and others have ongoing meetings with Sac State and others to push this project ahead. So really no specific schedule, but it is continuing. It is on the radar screen, and we'll see what happens in the months and years ahead as this is progressed.
Quick question on Crime Lab.
Yeah.
Is it assumed that the Crime Lab will be located on the campus?
That's a good question. Do we have any assumption as to where?
That's the understanding that we've had all along. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, and I don't know if, who the right people would be to have in the room to have the conversation. But I'm wondering if adjacency across the street, but on privately owned land as opposed to donated land, creates better opportunities to leverage that from an economic development standpoint as opposed to on the campus. When you start talking about what are some of the industries that would begin to sprout up being co-located adjacent to this type of a facility, does it make more sense to have it off campus with the adjacent potential job growth as opposed to forcing people on campus dealing with issues associated with being on campus, just having it right across the street kind of a thing? And I'd encourage, I mentioned Barry Broom earlier. Barry and John Jackson at William Jessup, John and Willie Duncan are together in charge of the innovation committee for Greater Sacramento Economic Council. Neither one of them knew that our board had taken this step to move forward with the Crime Lab and they were both extremely excited about that. And Barry started spinning on all the different job attraction opportunities something like this could create. So I'd strongly encourage you to chat with the two of them and get their sense of whether they think the lab physically located on the campus is the best attractor or immediately adjacent to the campus in this area that we've identified as our job center areas immediately adjacent to the campus.
Excellent points. We'll coordinate with CEO and DEA on that to further those discussions. So we'll reach out.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Then mentioned the County Admin Center, which was planned for directly across the street here at County Center Drive and Bell Road, which would be that full replacement. So as we talk through kind of the next series of slides, that this is kind of what's up for discussion is the need for this. Do we have the need for this with the availability that we've got? So this was part of the master plan and was approved and is currently part of the mix between here and the Mercy project. So this is kind of the game plan, which is what the master plan calls for, is the relocation of Fulweiler up to the new county admin center, and then with the introduction of Atherton, moving CRE down to Rockland from the FAB. So right now, and the upper bubble to the left there is moving folks upstairs here with the progression of HHS to the site just across the way. So this is kind of the current game plan as we move forward. So with those square footages that are becoming available, we've got 22,000 here upstairs and 18,000 what would become available at the FAB.
So this is looking at the FAB building, and the area that's highlighted on the left is where the clerk recorder is currently housed and where they would be vacating, and we would have the 18,000 square feet available to move in potential people from our campus at Fulweiler and at the Domes. So we're looking at the clerk recorder would be moving down to Atherton, and we'll talk about the schedule on that a little bit further down in the presentation. And we'll so this is the master plan showing where the location of the fab is at in the master plan. And the intent was to, let's see if I can get the pointer to work. The master plan had a expansion that we were proposing down the road where we could put in the housing the people from Fulweiler. But this plan we're going to show you today is looking at using our space that we currently have with the vacating of clerk recorder moving to Atherton. So this is the first floor plan, and the area that's in the bold black line is the area that clerk recorder currently is in. That's 18,380 square feet. And that's the area that we're going to look to backfill. And this is just for reference, the second floor. And we wanted to also talk about the CDRC space here. And we've highlighted the building we're currently in and the area that will be vacated by the staff that will be moving into the HHS building when that building comes online.
Would you do me a favor? Would you?
Yep.
Well, I think on that map right there, it might help me reconcile something.
Yes.
I might be looking at it wrong because they are a little bit small.
Just a little.
But help me reconcile page 7 or slide 7 and where I think I see slide 7 placing the HHS building versus this
Sure.
map.
So the HHS building is being proposed in this area right here.
That's what I thought. But is
Yes.
that does that not illustrate parking right there? Is that?
It does. And
Okay, so this has not been updated because is that not the HHS building up there in the blue? That
no,
that one right
this
there?
one is not. It's this one right here.
Oh, okay. All right.
And when the master plan was completed, which was a couple years ago,
Yeah.
since then we've done further research, and some of the staff that are currently housed in those buildings, if we build the building first and then move the staff, we could eliminate having to move them twice.
Okay.
So we looked at shifting the building slightly further south.
So it is the slide 7 that is reflective of the current thinking.
Correct.
Okay.
It is more
All right, thank you.
current.
I
Correct.
just looking
Yeah.
at it going,
Yeah, I mean, the master plan was done a couple years ago, and it's not something you would continually update, but we'll, reference back to it and use
Okay.
it as we move forward.
great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I was just going to add that slide 7 shows the site plan that will be given to the 3 design build
Okay.
teams.
So this is a floor plan of the CDRC building as it is now. We're currently in the Planning Commission room here. And the area shown in the darker black outline is referencing the area that we would be looking at modifying going forward. So DPW, which is currently in the space behind us in the building, they would be relocated up to the second floor, and the Planning Commission space and all of the open area here, we would look at how we could utilize that going forward for the Board of Supervisors space. And this is the second floor of the building we're currently in, and the outlined area is showing the HHS space that's currently being occupied that would be vacated into the new facility when that building comes online. It's about 22,000 square feet. This is a representation of the 3 buildings that I was actually just talking about, the lower 100 ramp buildings that have HHS staff in them now. And our current plan is looking at how we can build the new facility and keep them in their current facility as they are now. And then when the building comes online, we can relocate them and then demo these buildings as part of the new HHS building. And there is a component here that we'll talk about going forward to the learning and development is in 109, and they will be relocated, or we're looking at relocating them into the fab. So this is the current DOMES plan that I know you're all very familiar with. And so looking forward, we're looking at how we can take advantage of moving everybody out of the facility because of, one, there's an extreme amount of maintenance that's required for us to keep the building up and running for everybody and comfortable without ceilings falling down and all that good stuff. So the maintenance issues that we would by taking them offline, we wouldn't have the cost associated with that. And also the issue with being maxed out. There's no room for any growth, and all the departments are at their capacity in this facility. This is the current Fullweiler plan, first and second floor. Again, they are maxed out in this facility as well. There is no room for growth, and a few of the departments are looking for some room to grow. And we would also look at the opportunities to move everybody in the Fullweiler facility to this campus as well.
So looking at some schedules for both Atherton and HHS, that moving forward with those progressing now, that the current projection is to have CRE move down to Rockland by the summer, fall of 2022, and then a year later for the completion of HHS, with the move-in happening in the fall of 2023. So that would mean, that total of 40,000 square feet would be available. The first half of that in 22, and then the second half of that here at CDRC in 23. We did want to touch on office space usage moving forward. That was as we talked internally, and as we were looking at how we're using in particular business office space at different facilities, and how maybe the telecommute policy may play into that. And so we've just done some, as we've been talking to different departments and divisions as to how that's going to play out for space usage. It's going to be very different across the board. Some departments will have quite a bit. In talking to Jarrett and his team, they will have probably a lot of remote telecommuting. And talking to others, that everybody will be at the office. Here at Capital Improvements facilities, there will be a mix. But I think as we've been looking at it, not a lot of drastic changes to how we use space. It's going to be different. We're obviously going to need to continue with office space, but no current major modifications to programming of new office space. I think for us, the big push is just make sure that the space we do have is flexible and is changeable, adaptable as we can. So as we're looking at HHS, we're not looking to change the program, the 136,000 square feet there, but we do want to ensure that it can be used for any number of uses if need be. So the office space components outside of the lobby and the meeting rooms, the office spaces need to be super flexible. And talking to Rob and Raul with their potential telecommute approach, it'll be a mix, but we aren't necessarily changing the footprint at this point, because we just aren't seeing the need. We're not seeing the need for it. It's going to be different, but we do see the need for office space. But what we are seeing is this notion of hoteling that potentially, as which is our next slide here, looking at more of maybe a dynamic usage of workstations in particular. In that, as we've got our CARES funding coming on board with our technology, our laptops, that there may be the ability for those to, not necessarily have an assigned workstation, and we're then able to use our office space maybe a little bit differently, maybe a little more efficiency. So this notion of hoteling and dropping into an available workstation as opposed to a dedicated workstation may be coming, and we're seeing that coming up. So we went through, as we went through concepts, we went through a long list of how do we approach those concepts and what are the best ways to approach those. And, looking at our spaces differently, current planning direction with the existing master plan, getting department feedback, the best adjacencies. So here's an opportunity that as we move folks around, what are the best locations for those teams, those departments to interact with each other and with the adjacencies that they're coming into. Cost and schedule, yeah, just what are the ramifications in relation to, say, a new county admin building and for these moves? Lots of department feedback. And we did both individually with the departments. Steve's reached out at the leadership level, at the department head level. We also have the process that we went through with all the departments through the master plan process in getting to what was the vision for a county admin building. So I think everybody's bought into the notion of relocation. It's just how to best do it now. And then lots of board feedback to date with the master plan and all the various projects that we've had to date. So that's been instructive and informative as well. So some of the criteria and getting to these recommendations today, consolidation has been a big piece of the puzzle. How do we best move, as Genevieve was mentioning, say DPW is just an example, moving them back upstairs where Ken's group is to bring them together as a group. Service delivery proximity, as you know, since we've had our facilities, this disconnect between Fulweiler and the PCGC is there and obvious, and so now here's an opportunity to have that connectivity much sooner. Cost of the modifications, we'll be talking about that, and we've gone through a whole host of test fitting, and we continue to do test fitting for these locations. So even the diagrams we'll show you today, we've got feedback that these probably won't be the final end all. They're bubbles and concepts for these individual department locations, and they will change. So we do have options that we're going to be showing you today, and would love to get your feedback. And again, that bigger picture of 41,000 square feet that's going to be coming available within the next 3 years, and what do we need to do with that? And the big thing is just that relocation. And just that last point, their existing space types, very similar to what is needed. So office space. So we've got that here, and obviously much more, as Genevieve alluded to, is the condition is so much better here and at the fab than what we've got at the domes. And here's our opportunity to change those spaces and utilize those in a much better, bigger way. So these are the results of staff study and departmental feedback. These are just preliminary. So as we go through there's still lots of work to do. So as far as the key considerations, availability, need to relocate, the appropriate locations and adjacencies, greater use of those specific spaces and how to better utilize those once we move there, cost savings, that we're seeing that, and at least at this level. And the last thing there is, if we are considering not looking at needing that county admin building, is that we do have on that easterly side of the campus, in the master plan calls for private development. So that would then free up a space on the campus that would be on Bell, on County Center Drive, that would be potentially an anchor for private development here at the campus, that even more so, more important than maybe some of the other locations on campus. So this is the concept. With what we're going to be showing you is to, with the county admin building here, is potentially at this point not pursue that and open that up for other things. And as we move the various departments around to the new locations with Atherton, let's see how we backfill that 40,000 square feet with what we have at Fulweiler. So the concept for Fulweiler, the annex, is basically taking that square footage and moving it over to, for the most part, into Fulweiler, and the domes and its existing area and its functions there, moving that to CDRC, which, if this changes, obviously that may need a name change, but moving the functions into that 22,000 square feet that we would have available.
All right, so we're looking at the back at the fab building again. So what we looked at relocating here to this building was the human resources, the learning and development department, and library services, economic development, and risk. And there was some questions from some of the departments when we met with them about the adjacencies to the other facilities. So we wanted to definitely hit on that with everybody here, so everyone's aware. The distance between the fab building and the CDRC is probably no different than the walk between Fulweiler and the domes, or very similar. Then, the thought is that everybody would locate here on one site and one campus and minimize those trips down the hill, and everybody could just walk to see somebody if they needed to or to drop something off. The new HHS building would be right across the street from the FAB, and the FAB is right across from the AJC, and the CDRC is just across the parking lot. So I'll run through some square footage number comparisons here. The existing square footages for the departments are on the left that are in the annex facility, with our proposed square footages in the FAB, so you can get a comparison between the two, with a little bit of growth in the HR department based on their needs that they expressed to us. So a 10,000 square foot moving into 11,700. The libraries is currently at 974 square feet. That's in the annex building. Looking at moving them into the FAB, we would look at 2,500 square feet, but we would be bringing over their materials, staff as well, that is currently in the Auburn Library. So allowing them to be together, which currently they are not. We found some efficiencies there too, talking with them. So I'll go over that when we get to their plan. Risk management is at about 1,500 square feet in the annex, and they would be at about 1,200. We're also looking at the shared conference room space and shared spaces that would be in the FAB. So taking advantage of that, the spaces that need the conference rooms would have access to them throughout the whole building. Same with HHS. We'll have very large conference rooms available to the campus once that building comes online as well. Economic development is about 1,800 square feet, and moving into the FAB, they would be proposed around 1,300.
I was just going to add to that, Genevieve, that on the bottom there, the Business
Yes.
Advantage Network.
Yes,
so,
thank you.
Sorry, Stephanie.
No, that's okay. I forget about that line down at the bottom.
Okay.
Sorry. The Business Advantage Network is proposed would be in the new HHS facility. That's where their square footage is at. So they're not planned to be relocated into the FAB. So this is the floor plan of the FAB building, the first floor. And we're looking at the human resources would be in the location where the clerk recorder is currently housed and would be vacating. We looked at moving procurement. They're currently over here in the corner, moving them over next to human resources. There's some opportunities there again for the shared conference room space. They need a large conference room. They both do, but they don't need it all the time. And so looking at how we can take advantage of sharing some of those spaces. We looked at putting libraries in the back. There was an addition done to the building a few years ago. It's a small single-story space, very pretty, has lots of beautiful natural light in there. But they have a small dock in the back, and libraries had expressed some interest in being able to have access to a loading dock. They get a lot of shipments, and the stuff just comes into the facility, gets logged, gets sent back out to their locations, and this would help them function a lot better than they currently are now. We looked at moving the learning and development group into the space behind the stairs. If any of you have been over to the FAB, it's a nice, beautiful two-story space there that's being underutilized. And we would look at making that a large conference room for the full-day training, for new employee orientations, those types of activities. This would give them opportunity to have a lot of natural light out the back of the building. They could have the patio in the back. People could take breaks during the day. The restrooms are right there.
Is that currently the break area, the public?
It is.
So that would go away?
There is there used to be a cafe here that has gone away. It's no longer there.
Oh, the cafe's already gone?
Yeah, it's been gone for a while. So there's just a seating area there now.
Okay.
So the seating area would go away. However, we would look at how we could potentially make the patio area outside a little more inviting and user-friendly for those types of activities.
Since you're not performing weddings there anymore.
Correct. They will be on the lawn at the Atherton site now. We were scoping out where that was going to go just a couple days ago. We looked at moving risk over here in the corner. This would allow them to have a front counter access still, which they need. And CRE will still have a small presence at the campus, probably 6 to 8 people or so. So we've left them some space there. Again, they will also have a front counter access. And then economic development, putting them in the space here. Again, just want to reiterate, these are bubble diagram representations of some concept ideas. They're not completely figured out and determined. Walls would shift and move, and as we meet with departments and determine all their needs. And the one item that's not resolved here is the IT department. They're the ones that have the most amount of flex with the teleworking policy right now. So we're still working through their numbers that they've shared with us on how many people would be on campus versus how many people would be continuing to telework, and how we can take advantage of those hoteling stations that Paul was mentioning. So we would look at some expansion for IT, because we have space up on the second floor that they would be moving out of. So we definitely want to maintain their square footage, and they have expressed interest in trying to be all on one floor together. So we're just trying to work through all of those. And as we develop the rest of the spaces with the rest of the departments, we would work through those issues with them. So this is a little bit closer up location image of the area where human resources would be, and the square footages that are associated with each of the departments. And again, the other side of the building with the square footage is shown. The second floor would remain predominantly the same. Most of the departments on the second floor, when we met with them, didn't need any increased square footages. However, the assessor does need a little bit of additional office space, and would like a mail room. And so we would look at how we could modify that. And again, we want to continue to work with IT to see if we can get them so they're all together in one space. And this is the lobby space. We've talked a lot about it internally, about how we can take advantage of a very underutilized space and potentially build in an information desk in the lobby that would provide a staff person to direct everybody where to go in the building. A lot of people come in and they're confused. They don't know where to go depending on what they're trying to do. And with the counter space on both the first and the second floor, this would allow them to direct somebody where to go, hopefully a little more clearer with a lot less wandering around.
Any questions on kind of those concepts at the FAB? So we're going to switch gears and kind of look at what we're proposing conceptually for the CDRC. And this is obviously the move from the domes in concept for the board. And as Genevieve mentioned, using this space as potentially a shared commission board chambers amongst all the, I know we have PCDPA, we have the assessor, I think it's resolution. We've got several other groups that do meet in here. So we'll have to talk about, if we are using this space for multiple boards, how we utilize that. And so we don't have a lot of overlap there and how we work through that. But, for the domes where we have 98 fixed seats, as you know, coming to this location, looking at 169 occupancy, that maybe we can change that with some modifications here too, but much bigger space. And then clerk of the board, CEO, county council, and at this point, PIO, public information, moving up from the annex to this location. Similar slide to what Genevieve had for the site for FAB is just, again, the kind of the highlights of, what this building allows us to use it differently. It obviously has access to what would be the new HHS center, the using FAB and HAC and others here on campus, obviously. But it does give us the building does have a County Center Drive address. Bell Road, the most prominent road and adjacency from an access perspective, corner of Richardson and Bell. So again, that location is key, I think, for these functions, and this building has it. So we were considering using a new county admin center, which would have been right across the street. But this existing facility still gives us a lot of that. And even at the site level, we may look at some site modifications for parking, access, maybe some other things. But at this point, that it does meet a lot of our needs, checks a lot of boxes, if you will, for a different approach to use. So existing area, the domes, so the square footage on the left, and as we move to the square footage on the right at the CDRC. So as Genevieve mentioned, that at the domes, county council, see, everybody's hemmed in there, and they do need additional space for meeting space, offices and other things. So as we do have the ability to have more square footage at this location to accommodate what would be current need and potential growth in the future for those uses. So the square footage for the board and the clerk stay about the same. We'll still need to consider that and study that as we move forward. But the thought is that those would stay fairly consistent. And then PIO potentially moving over from the annex. And just a little note there that as you look at the square footage there, that the domes, the board chambers there is just about classroom size, 1,500 square feet at that location. And then, if we were to look at this space, obviously quite a bit different from a square footage perspective. This is just a quick diagram to show kind of that inherent properties or adjacencies that come along with the building, the architecture, the interiors, and what could be available for utilizing this space in a shared fashion. So the existing, obviously, chambers that we're in now, all the back of house is still very critical. Private restrooms, the public restrooms off the lobby, our technology that's our team is working, Bill and others are working behind the scenes now with that. The break room, as you just had your private kind of was it
Closed session.
Thank you, Genevieve. Closed session. Those spaces are available in the back area as well. And just locationally, that area, which would provide offices for the board, is on that beautiful green space and off of that area that does give you, at least visually and from a presence perspective, a great location. So this is how those bubbles for that square footage would lay out. From a bigger perspective, Cedra and Steve's group would obviously maintain the largest portion of the building. And then as we utilize potentially really the main lobby, the chambers, the restrooms, and then the space freed up by DPW for that back of house, that would then become those functions of clerk of the board, Todd's office, the board of supervisors for those functions behind that larger bubble, which would be a shared committee or planning and board chamber space. So zooming in a little bit, the thought here is that with the lobby and access and those visiting, that maybe we do have a little bit more presence from an informational and wayfinding perspective, that those are things that we can add so that as the public comes in, that we do have that resource so that we're maybe not overwhelming, say, the Cedra DPW counter, and that obviously that function would continue on. So in this scenario, as you come into the lobby, that maybe there's a check-in or maybe there is a direct access to reception there for Terry and Megan's space that would be just off and behind that area, off to the, I guess it'd just be to the right of that existing elevator. And then with that, the board itself with offices around the perimeter on the window wall there, and just inherently with access from a kind of a side door here for parking, and then access to the dais here, which could potentially have some changes to it as well. Any questions on that? Great. So again, as we've been saying, this is still just, they're bubble diagrams, they're just concepts, and really just looking for feedback today. And as we progress, there's still quite a few steps to go to make sure these are good test fits for these locations. So moving upstairs, these are the diagrams, the bubbles that represent the square footage we talked about earlier. So we do have DPW that's moved upstairs from their location, public information potentially here, which we've already heard feedback that this may not be the best fit. So we're still kind of working through, as Genevieve mentioned, with IT. We'll still kind of go through this exercise of making sure we're putting these folks in the right locations. But for now, CEO and its square footage and expanded square footage from the domes. And again, with county council more off to the side, less or more of a private location against that window wall with its access to meeting, break, conference, restrooms. These are all the shared spaces that kind of feed into and support what would be those office spaces. And again, they do, as you know, they've got a built-in reception desk. So it's already kind of set up, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of the right use to be able to move them to this location. And then a little bit on schedule for, if we were to consider these tenant improvements, how soon and when these would occur. That if we look at potentially design in 21, 22, construction could occur right after, this is the fab, construction could occur right after CRE, clerk recorder elections, moves down to Rockland. And the construction would have us with a move in 2023. So the folks at the annex could be moved out by that time. And then a year later with HHS. So with that construction finishing up in 2024. And so we went through kind of a series of very rough kind of cost estimate, because as we evaluated each of the spaces, they're also different as far as the amount of tenant improvement. So this is still an area that we still need to get through and spend some more time with. But we gave a square footage cost to each of these. So for instance, like DPW, environmental utilities, we kind of configured their location based on almost very little improvement based on workstations and office count and what have you for their staff. So their move would be very, very simple, if you will, from the first floor location. If you look at other folks like, in this case, the bigger numbers, say for human resources, there will be more changes there that as we go to an environment that takes into account their needs and changes from CRE to HR, there will be changes there that are more significant, more costly. And then same at the CDRC, varying levels of tenant improvements. So at least the range right now, we're looking at $2.3 to $3.4 million for those improvements at this location, depending on how far we take them. So this is kind of the culmination of kind of the wanting feedback on the kind of that notion of the county admin building. And we're currently tracking that $42 million cost there, that if we look at that in comparison to what would be the numbers we just talked about, going from say a $6 to $8 million rough order number to that 42 million, obviously there's a big change there. And as Atherton has come into the picture, this allows us to think very differently as to how much we would be spending on consolidation from Fulweiler. So one of the bigger concepts here is moving ahead and moving the folks at the domes, moving the services at the domes to CDRC, and what could be a name change there, obviously. And then for the folks at the annex to the fab for the most part. That's obviously the kind of the bigger idea. And as Genevieve mentioned, for the existing fab building, that if we do need to account for additional space somewhere down the road, that we do have this idea of an annex that would be an attachment to that existing building that would allow us additional square footage or need, if we find it in the future, for county uses or services at that particular facility. So as we've talked to the other folks on the second floor there, we haven't seen a huge need for expansion at this point. We feel like, that currently with those moves at the fab that we've accounted for square footage that would remain about the same for those other functions. And really just a reminder on that site, which was the county admin space, county admin building, that we're already up and running right across the street from that site with private functions that in this case, that would be a potential for what could be an anchor, a very important location for private development here at the campus. So we do have Griffin Swinnerton, which is a developer that is helping us with feasibility as we speak, that Shauna Purvines and I with Cedra are working with them to come up with information that relates to what would be the best fit for functions, even within amongst COVID, for both the PCGC and the Fulweiler sites. So they're looking at both locations. So this is just a diagram to show that, for the master plan on the east side of the campus, that's set up currently for private development, and that would just be a continuation to consider for what would be a different opportunity where the county admin building is on the master plan. All right, and we'll be coming back to the board with information from Griffin Swinnerton in the coming months. They're well into their feasibility study, and we're working with them closely, both economic development, real estate, facilities management, to work with them on that to come up with that study that we'll be presenting back to the board. So these are the adjustments that we're wanting feedback on: consolidation of services to the PCGC. So utilizing that existing square footage for those changes, adjustments to the 5-year facility CIP with the potential not going ahead with, say, a county admin building with these changes. And for moving ahead, we're looking at potential private development studies and or studies at both sites that I just mentioned. So we'll be back to the board to talk to you about that. So moving ahead, we do have additional planning work that we have ahead of us. And for feedback and direction, these are the areas that we're looking for that. With the changes, coming back and looking at further direction or information to follow up with on costs for those changes. And again, coming back with more detail as to feasibility and planning for both those sites moving forward. So if we make those changes, what's going to happen to Fulweiler, after we move off that site. So with that, anything else? No, with that, I would like to bring it back to the board.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the presentation. Questions, feedback, thoughts? Yeah. Go ahead.
Definitely, I had a few. First off, thanks. It's really exciting to think of the cost savings and the efficiencies for county operations with kind of the thought process you've been through. I'm really excited about that, but I think we haven't said enough about service to our constituents and understanding where they're to go and that they're on this campus when they're dealing with so many of the county functions, because I've definitely had people confused as to where to go and then what's their next step. And so I think that that'll be huge as well. And I think we always have to remember that.
Mm-hmm.
I had one question on economic development. It seems like it should be over in this building if possible when I look at interaction with CEDRA, Public Works. And so if there's a way, I mean, it's not much space. Just a thought, I'd love to hear. I know when you do space analysis, you usually look at numbers of meetings and who meets with whom and what goes on. And I would certainly think economic development is maybe more in line with CEDRA than.
And we're actually in the process of that. Maybe there is that move. So like I said, was mentioning, public information is maybe not thinking that's the best fit for them there. So there's still that to be worked out.
Right. And then finally on Fulweiler, I really want us to work closely with the city of Auburn. I mentioned this before. This isn't my final one. I have one more. But I want to work with the city of Auburn and make that a win-win and looking at how we do some sort of mixed use or private development opportunities there and what helps meet some of the housing issues and other things that we're facing, that they're facing, and we have joint interest in, similar to the great efforts we did at the grounds and in working on a collaborative approach. And my final thought was just in this room and trying to ensure that we have adequate space for meetings. It seems like we have been, this is a great space, but do we need more space? What kind of technology and meeting schedules do we have that we might want to make sure we have adequate space for those larger groups or multiple groups meeting at one time?
Yeah, one thing I didn't mention, or we didn't mention, is with HHS that we do have a fairly large space that it's 3 parts that have the partitions. So that building will have a fairly large meeting room.
In comparison to this, what does that look like?
What's that?
It's larger, isn't it?
Yeah, it is larger. I'd have to get back to you on square footage, but once it's opened up, and actually has a break room piece of it, so it's actually 4 spaces all put together.
Okay, great.
And just to add on to that, reusing this space, great to maybe get rid of the stationary seats, even though they're more comfortable than regular chairs, except that gives this space and flexibility for different types of meetings where you could meet with groups of people and be flexible. I think that could be helpful.
Or heaven forbid, separation. If we had to
Right.
continue.
I appreciate the update, and I really love the fact that honestly, because of COVID, we've been able to realize that people can be flexible in their work hours, right? Being able to work at home part-time or about part of the time, or actually maybe work at home more than part of the time, depending on the type of job it is. So just based on that, it looks like 42,000, it was about 42,000 square feet was the proposed a new admin building. That's a lot of flexibility with staff. And I think it's terrific that we can provide that flexibility with staff, with departments, with employees, depending on the type of job it is. So I just think that, as we've had to pivot with COVID, it's allowed us to try new things and see what works. And that has to do with not only space, but technology. So it's just really great to see. A question about the ag building, because I see Josh sitting in the back. Where is the ag building, and where are we in that process?
Yeah, let me just quickly go back to maybe one of the slides that has the, so we're currently tracking, the master plan, at least in this case, is still in kind of in that,
Sure.
if we had our wish list on, getting to a new ag building, that's still where that footprint would be. So,
Over where A and C is?
where C is
C
next
is.
to, yeah. So that's still far further down the road. We'll see how that works itself out. But currently the idea is to kind of still look at that. We do have other opportunities within maybe our 208, 9, and 10 building that may be something else to look at. But we continue to consider the needs of ag commissioner and that space. We are right in the process of moving weights and measures down to building 301. So working with Josh on that now, which is building 307, the building that is where the coroner is, which is one of the worst on campus. So we're right in the middle of upgrading, providing Josh some additional space down at 301, which is the A side here now.
Great, thank you. Question, any other questions, feedback, Supervisor Holmes?
Well, I don't have any questions. It's nice to have options, and you've done a great job with all the bubbles, and we've opened up space that we can utilize for private development and then housing at the Coolweiler site. So I'm encouraged by the work here that we're able to do.
Supervisor Euler? Oh, no, okay. One thought is that when we do decide to demo those domes, maybe we invite former county supervisors and staff to all participate in singing a sledgehammer. But
I'm in.
it could be fundraiser.
Yeah.
Have I ever shared with you what my dream is for that? I want to
don't
be
know if
up on the hill back on the other side of Nevada Street and call in the F-18s and have them come in and airstrike. Watch it all go up.
All right. Well, we've got a couple of years to figure out how to do that.
It's great work, really exciting, look forward to it. And I'll echo quickly Cindy's comment about economic development. Not only there's a linkage there with CEDRA, but also with the county exec's office.
Okay.
Sometimes there are some pretty exciting things that are fast breaking, and I think that proximity makes a lot of sense. That could be done.
Okay, good.
So let's go ahead and open this up to the public. If anybody would like to make a comment, input, suggestions, something that wasn't discussed and you have this amazing idea. All right, and then we'll go ahead and close public comment. Terrific. So more to come. When do you anticipate? Oh, one other thought though.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that as you are looking at moving and renovating the Atherton property, that gets done in enough time in 2022 prior to the general election, right? I mean, you probably know that, but considering how crazy elections are and the amount of time it takes to move operations, I think that's just really important to be aware of.
Yeah,
so
we're
they're up
working
and
really
running.
closely with Ryan to accommodate all of the elections that are popping up in between. But yeah, he brings that up on a regular basis.
Hopefully,
So
we
we-
won't have to have any special elections between now and then, so that would be nice.
Good.
All right, well, thank you very much. Just a great job and really terrific at looking at how we can utilize existing space and saving those taxpayer dollars, which of course we don't even have enough to build all this right away. So that's the other part, right? We've got to figure out where all the dollars come from. All right, so with that, let's see, anything else on my agenda? I think not. So then we will be adjourned till our next supervisor meeting, which is next Tuesday, November 17th. Thank you, everyone.